The morning Eudora Winslow shot a rattlesnake off the fence post with her dead husband's rifle, while simultaneously keeping the bread from burning and settling a fight between her two youngest children was, by her own estimation, an ordinary Tuesday in the summer of 1878. She had not always been this capable. There had been a time, a lifetime ago it seemed, when she had been the soft-handed daughter of a Virginia schoolteacher, a woman who read poetry aloud and pressed wildflowers between the pages of books. That woman had crossed the Mississippi in a covered wagon at the age of 22, newly married to a man named Thomas Winslow who had big dreams and an even bigger laugh. Thomas had pointed at a stretch of flat Texas land outside a small town called Harlan Creek and said it would be the finest wheat farm west of the Sabine River. Eudora had believed him, because Thomas had a way of making you believe in things. Thomas had been dead for 3 years now, a fever that came in the night and left by morning, taking him with it, leaving Eudora at 29 with 4 children, a farm in debt, and the driest stretch of Texas whether anyone in Harlan Creek could remember. 3 years without adequate rain. 3 years of watching the sky for clouds that rarely delivered what they promised. 3 years of Eudora Winslow doing what needed to be done, because there was simply no one else to do it. Her oldest, Clara, was 12 now and had her mother's dark hair and her father's stubborn jaw. Then came Samuel, who was 10 and spent every spare moment building things out of scrap wood. Harriet was 7 and possessed an imagination so vivid it sometimes frightened adults. And finally there was little George, just turned 5, who followed Eudora everywhere like a small shadow and asked more questions before breakfast than most people asked in a week. They lived in a 2-room farmhouse that Eudora had repaired herself, rechinked the walls herself, patched the roof herself after a windstorm the previous autumn. The garden she tended was the kind that came from pure desperation, every planted inch calculated to produce maximum food with minimum water. She kept 3 chickens, a milk cow named Patience, and a mule named Job, both of whom had earned their biblical names through the suffering they endured alongside their owner. She bartered eggs and sewing work with the general store in Harlan Creek, traded labor with neighboring farms during harvest seasons, and sometimes went without supper so her children would not have to. Nobody in Harlan Creek called this extraordinary. People were too tired from their own struggles to notice anyone else's. A woman surviving on her own was either pitied or ignored, and Eudora had decided somewhere in the 2nd year of widowhood that she preferred being ignored. Pity had a way of making people feel they owed you something, which made them resentful, which made things worse. She simply got on with it. It was on a Wednesday morning in late August of 1878 that Gilbert Barnett rode into Harlan Creek on a bay horse named Solomon, trailing a pack mule loaded with surveying equipment and 2 leather saddlebags full of everything he owned. Gilbert was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent his life working with his hands, with dark auburn hair that the Texas sun had begun to streak with copper, and a habit of going still and quiet when he was thinking hard that people sometimes mistook for slowness. He was not slow. He had spent 7 years working as a land surveyor out of San Antonio, riding the length and width of the state, mapping parcels and settling boundary disputes, and occasionally doing work for the railroad, which was beginning to push its fingers into even the remotest parts of Texas. He had come to Harlan Creek because the county land office had hired him to resurvey several disputed parcels on the eastern edge of the county, a job that would take him 3 or 4 weeks at minimum. He had no wife. He had come close once with a woman in San Antonio named Margaret, but Margaret had wanted a man who came home every evening, and Gilbert could not seem to stop moving, and so they had parted without much bitterness, and with a quiet sadness that Gilbert still carried like a small stone in his chest on cold nights. He took a room at Harlan Creek's only boarding house, a place run by a widow named Mrs. Albright who served breakfast at 6 sharp and tolerated no nonsense. He ate his first breakfast there on a Thursday morning, sitting across from the town's only doctor, a man named Prescott who had the red nose of a man who drank medicinally, and beside a quiet farmhand named Dobbs who had the manners of someone who had been raised right and had simply run out of luck. It was Dobbs who first mentioned Eudora Winslow. "You'll be surveying out near the Caldwell parcel?" Dobbs asked, buttering his bread with the focus of a man who had not eaten enough recently. "Among others," Gilbert said. "I'll need to start from the Winslow fence line, I understand. The old Winslow homestead is the established benchmark for that whole eastern quarter." Dobbs nodded slowly. "Eudora Winslow's place. You'll want to introduce yourself proper before you go walking her fence lines. She doesn't take kindly to strangers appearing on her land without notice." "That seems reasonable," Gilbert said. "More than reasonable," Dr. Prescott said from behind his coffee cup. "Woman's been holding that place together by sheer force of will for 3 years. Lost her husband in '75. 4 children. Hasn't asked a soul for help she didn't intend to pay back." Gilbert filed this information in his mind the way he filed everything, quietly and carefully, and the following Monday morning he rode out to the Winslow farm. He smelled the bread baking before he reached the gate. The farmyard was spare but orderly in a way that spoke of someone who could not afford disorder. The fence was mended with wire and salvaged wood, but mended thoroughly. The vegetable garden was impressive given the drought. Clearly someone had been hauling water by hand, which was brutal work in August heat. A little boy of about 5 was sitting on the porch steps, sorting dried beans into 2 piles, with the solemn focus of a banker counting gold. Gilbert tied Solomon to the fence post and walked up to the gate. "Good morning," he called out. "I'm looking for Mrs. Winslow." The little boy looked up. "That's my mama. She's inside. She says I'm not supposed to let strangers pass the gate." "Your mama sounds like a sensible woman," Gilbert said. "Would you tell her Gilbert Barnett is here? I'm the county surveyor. I need to speak with her about her fence lines." The boy considered this with enormous seriousness. "Are you going to take our land?" "No," Gilbert said. "I'm just going to measure it." The boy disappeared inside, and a moment later Eudora Winslow appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Gilbert's first impression was of a woman who had been beautiful and was still beautiful, though she wore her beauty the way she wore everything else, without particular attention to it, because she was too busy. She was tall for a woman of the era, with dark hair pinned up but escaping in several directions at once, dark eyes that measured him from 30 feet away, with a frankness that was not unfriendly but was absolutely unambiguous, and the kind of straight spine that comes not from pride but from necessity. "Mr. Barnett," she said, coming down off the porch, "what exactly does the county need to measure?" He explained about the Caldwell parcel dispute, about the survey work he would need to do along the eastern fence lines, about the established benchmarks. She listened without interrupting, which he found unusual and appreciated. When he was finished, she asked 3 precise questions about how close his equipment would come to her livestock and whether he would need access to her well, and he answered each one carefully. "All right," she said finally. "You can start at the eastern corner post on Wednesday morning. I'll have Clara show you where the original survey stakes are buried. She knows this land better than I do in some ways." "I'm much obliged," he said, and meant it. She nodded, already turning back toward the house. Then she paused. "Have you had water, Mr. Barnett? It's 11 miles back to town and it's already hot." "I'm fine, ma'am." "I didn't ask if you were fine," she said, in a tone that was not unkind but brooked no argument. "I asked if you'd had water." He had not, as it happened, thought to bring enough. He admitted this. She brought him a tin cup of water drawn from the well, cool and slightly mineral tasting the way good Texas well water sometimes was, and stood in the yard while he drank it with the sun already hammering down. "Thank you," he said, handing back the cup. "Don't forget to bring more on Wednesday," she said, and went back inside. He rode back toward town with the empty tin cup image in his mind and a strange warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the August heat. On Wednesday morning, Gilbert arrived at the Winslow farm at 7, as agreed. Clara was waiting for him at the gate, 12 years old and wearing an expression of profound responsibility. She had her mother's dark eyes and a measuring quality to her gaze that suggested she had learned very young to assess whether adults could be trusted. "Mama says I'm to show you the corner stakes and then come back for morning chores," Clara said. "She also says if you trample the garden beds she will not be pleased." "I will give the garden beds a very wide berth," Gilbert assured her. Clara led him along the eastern fence line with the confidence of someone who had walked it 100 times. She pointed out each survey stake she knew of, showed him where the old cedar post had been replaced and where it had not, explained which neighboring parcels had been sold and to whom. She was, Gilbert thought, an extraordinary child. She spoke with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who had been given real responsibility and had risen to meet it. "How long have you been helping your mother run the farm?" he asked, setting up his theodolite at the northeast corner. "Since Papa died," Clara said simply. "Samuel helps too, and Harriet when she isn't daydreaming. George mostly helps by asking questions." "Your mother seems very capable," Gilbert said carefully. Clara looked at him. "She works harder than anyone I've ever seen. She was up before 4 this morning because Patience gave less milk yesterday and Mama was worried. She patches the roof when it needs patching. She fixed the well pulley with baling wire last spring." She paused. "She never cries where we can see her." Gilbert was quiet for a moment, adjusting his equipment. "But she does cry." "Sometimes I hear her at night," Clara said, matter-of-factly, in the way of a child who has decided that facts are safer than feelings. "But then she stops, and in the morning she makes us breakfast." He didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything adequate to say. He worked along the fence line for most of the morning, taking measurements, recording numbers in his ledger with the methodical care his work required. He saw Eudora twice from a distance, once carrying water to the garden in 2 large buckets suspended from a wooden yoke across her shoulders, moving with the practiced economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and once hanging washing on the line with little George passing her the clothespins from a basket. At noon he ate his packed lunch under the single cottonwood tree near the eastern boundary. He had been sitting there for about 5 minutes when footsteps approached, and he looked up to find Eudora walking toward him with a plate covered by a cloth. "I made extra corn bread this morning," she said, setting the plate down on the stump beside him. She stood with her arms crossed in the way of a woman who does not sit down in the middle of the day because sitting down in the middle of the day is a luxury she has forgotten exists. "You don't have to eat it." "I'd very much like to eat it," he said. "Thank you." She didn't leave immediately. She stood looking out at the eastern pasture, which was dry and brown in the heat, the grass sparse in the way that 3 years of inadequate rain produces. He could see the worry she carried about it in the set of her jaw. "It's been bad out here," he said quietly. 3 years of less rain than needed," she said. "We get some, not enough. The wheat doesn't grow right without enough. The kitchen garden does better because I haul water for it." She said this without self-pity, the way you might describe weather conditions or geological features. "That's a great deal of work," he said. "It's what has to be done," she said. He looked at her. "Mrs. Winslow, I don't mean to overstep, but Dr. Prescott in town mentioned that you've been managing this farm alone for 3 years with 4 children. He said it with a kind of wonder." She turned to look at him, and her expression was not warm exactly, but it was honest. "Dr. Prescott is a kind man and a decent doctor when he's sober, but people always want to make it something remarkable. It isn't remarkable. I have children who need to be fed and a farm that can feed them if I work it hard enough. The math is simple." "The math may be simple," Gilbert said. "The doing of it is something else entirely." She studied him for a moment with those dark eyes. "You're from the East?" she asked, changing the subject. "Tennessee originally," he said. "Been in Texas 7 years." "Tennessee," she said in the tone of someone reaching back for a distant memory. "My father was from Virginia. I grew up there. Sometimes I miss the green." "I miss it too," he said honestly. Though I've come to love Texas in a different way, there's something about this landscape that gets into you." "It does," she agreed. She picked up the empty cloth she'd brought the corn bread in. "I need to get back. Clara will be starting the afternoon washing and she needs direction." "Mrs. Winslow," he said, and she paused. "The corn bread is excellent, thank you." She looked at him for a beat too long, the way people do when they're not quite sure what to do with simple kindness. Then she nodded once and walked back toward the house with the same brisk, purposeful stride. He ate the corn bread, which was indeed excellent, dense and savory with a crust that had exactly the right amount of crispness. He sat there for a few minutes longer than he needed to, looking at the dry brown pasture and thinking about a woman who hauled water before dawn and never cried where her children could see her. He came back on Thursday to continue the survey, and on Friday. The county's work was more extensive than initially estimated. The disputed Caldwell parcels abutting the Winslow fence lines at 3 different points, requiring triangulation measurements that took time and precision. On Friday afternoon, Samuel found him near the south fence and introduced himself with a formal handshake that made Gilbert smile. Samuel was 10, compact and serious, with a measuring eye that he had clearly inherited from his mother. "Mr. Barnett," Samuel said, "I've been thinking about the fence post in the southeast corner. It leans about 2 inches to the west. Does that affect your measurements?" Gilbert looked at him. "You know about survey error correction." Samuel shrugged, which was not modest so much as honest. "I don't know the name for it, but if you're measuring from a post that's not straight, the line comes out wrong." "You're absolutely right," Gilbert said. "I'm compensating for the lean." He showed Samuel his notes explaining the correction factor, and Samuel listened with complete attention, asking 2 or 3 questions that were remarkably precise for a 10-year-old. "How do you learn this?" Samuel asked. "School, mostly, and then doing the work." "You have a good mind for it." Samuel absorbed this compliment without much reaction, the way children absorb compliments when they're too hungry for them to quite believe them. "Mama says I can get more schooling if we save enough," he said. "There's a school in Beaumont that teaches proper mathematics." "She's right to aim for it," Gilbert said. "You do well." That evening, Gilbert sat in his room at the boarding house and tried to read and found he could not concentrate on the page. He was thinking about a 10-year-old who understood survey error compensation, and a 12-year-old who knew every inch of the fence line, and a woman who carried water in the dark and made extraordinary corn bread, and looked at simple kindness like it was something she had almost forgotten existed. He realized with some surprise, looking forward to Monday morning in a way that had nothing to do with survey benchmarks. Over the following 2 weeks, as September came in and the heat began, infinitesimally, to ease at the margins, Gilbert Barnett fell into the rhythm of arriving at the Winslow farm in the mornings, working his way along the survey lines, and finding that the day had a particular quality to it that his days had not had in quite some time. Eudora did not make anything easy or obvious. She was not a flirtatious woman. Flirtation seemed to have gone out of her life with the green of Tennessee, though Gilbert suspected it had never been much in her nature regardless. But she was increasingly willing to stop for a few minutes when she crossed his path, to exchange words about the weather, about the county disputes, about things she had read in the newspaper that the general store received 2 weeks late from Austin. He learned things in fragments. That she had read extensively, that she had opinions about national politics that were sharp and well-reasoned, that she had a dry humor that surfaced unexpectedly and made her eyes do something that wasn't quite a smile but was the precursor to one, that she was 32 years old, born in Virginia in 1846, and had crossed the country at 22 with absolute confidence in a man she had loved completely. That she still spoke of Thomas without bitterness, only with the particular weariness of someone who has been through a grief so deep it has reshaped the landscape of who they are. "He would have loved this surveying work you're doing," she told Gilbert one afternoon. She had brought water out for him, a habit she had apparently decided upon without announcing it. Thomas was always fascinated by how things were measured and laid out. He used to spend evenings drawing maps of the farm, planning what would go where. "He sounds like a man with a vision," Gilbert said. "He was," she said. "He was also a man who died of a fever at 31 and left me with 4 children and 60 acres of clay soil." She said it without cruelty, without grief, just as fact. Then she seemed to hear how it sounded and looked away. "I don't mean that dismissively. I loved him. I just stopped pretending he was perfect somewhere in the second year of managing without him." "That seems healthy," Gilbert said. She looked at him with some surprise. "Most people want you to keep the martyred widow pose. It makes them more comfortable." "I'm not most people," he said, which was so straightforward that she blinked. "No," she said after a moment. "I'm beginning to see that." She left before he could say anything else, but he noticed that she did not quite keep the almost smile off her face as she went. The children were, in their various ways, becoming familiar with him. George had appointed himself a kind of informal assistant, appearing at Gilbert's side and carrying things that did not strictly need carrying with tremendous seriousness. Harriet had decided that he was a character in one of the ongoing interior stories she lived in, and addressed him with a ceremonial formality that he had learned to take at face value. Samuel peppered him with mathematical questions. Only Clara maintained a careful reserve, watching him from a distance with those dark measuring eyes. It was Clara who approached him on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-September, alone, with the deliberate manner of someone who has been working up to something. "Mr. Barnett," she said, "what are your intentions toward my mother?" He looked at her. She was 12 years old and she looked in that moment about 35. He decided she deserved an honest answer. "I don't rightly know yet," he said. "I think she's an admirable woman. I think I enjoy talking to her. I'm not going to tell you anything that isn't true just to make you feel better." Clara considered this for a long moment. "She's very tired," she said finally. "Not just from the work, tired in a deeper way. She tries not to show it." "I know," he said. "She doesn't need someone to rescue her," Clara said very clearly. "She'd hate that. She's not someone who needs rescuing." "I understand that," Gilbert said. "I don't think anyone should rescue her from anything. I just think she might deserve someone who notices what she's carrying." Another long pause. Clara was watching him with the same evaluative quality her mother used, and he had the distinct sensation of being assessed. "All right," Clara said finally, as if she had reached a conclusion. She turned and walked back toward the house. He shook his head slowly and went back to his measurements, smiling without quite meaning to. The first real conversation that felt like more than conversation happened the following Thursday evening. Gilbert had stayed later than usual to finish triangulating the southwest corner, and by the time he began packing up his equipment, the sun was dropping toward the horizon in the particular orange blaze that the Texas dust made of sunsets. He was carrying his theodolite case to his horse when Eudora appeared at the gate. "You'll be riding in the dark if you don't stay for supper," she said. Her tone was practical, not warm, but she met his eyes and held them. He knew she did not issue this invitation lightly. He knew it cost her something in both pride and resources, and he knew she knew he knew it, and the knowing sat between them like something fragile and valuable. "I'd be honored," he said simply. Supper was corn bread and beans, and a piece of smoked pork that had clearly been saved for an occasion. The table was small and the family filled it, and the noise of 4 children at supper was a thing Gilbert had forgotten existed. George asked him 7 questions before the food was distributed. Harriet described a dream she'd had about a horse that could speak Spanish. Samuel asked whether the railroad coming through the county would affect land survey requirements. Clara said almost nothing but watched. Eudora moved through it all with the quiet competence of someone who has managed chaos until it becomes simply the texture of life. She served. She settled disputes about portions. She reminded George twice to chew before talking, and she answered Samuel's railroad question with more knowledge than Gilbert expected. "You've been following the railroad development," he said to her. "It affects this farm," she said. If the rail line comes through 40 miles south as planned, I might be able to get wheat to market more efficiently. If it comes through 15 miles north as the other survey suggests, the freight rates change considerably. She looked at him. I read everything I can get my hands on. I know, he said. Dr. Prescott mentioned the library you've built up. She snorted, which was an unguarded sound, surprised out of her. Library. It's 47 books in a crate and a subscription to the Austin paper, though I suppose in Harlan Creek that qualifies. It qualifies anywhere, he said. After supper, the children cleared the table with practiced efficiency, George supervised by Clara, and Eudora poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove, black and strong, and set one in front of Gilbert without asking how he took it, which he found he did not mind at all. They sat at the cleared table while the sounds of children settling into the other room floated in through the doorway. The oil lamp cast a warm, unsteady light. Outside the window, the darkness was complete, and the stars of a Texas sky were starting to show in numbers that would have seemed impossible in any city. The survey will be finished by end of next week, Gilbert said. She wrapped her hands around her cup. I know, a pause. Then I'll have no particular business reason to be on your property, he said. I know that too, she said. The lamp flickered. Somewhere in the other room, Harriet was telling George a bedtime story in a voice that rose and fell dramatically. Mrs. Winslow, Gilbert said, and then stopped, because the thing he wanted to say was large and he was not sure of the approach. Eudora, she said, not looking up from her cup. I think at this point you can call me Eudora. Eudora, he said, and her name in his mouth felt like something that had always belonged there. I would like, with your permission, to keep coming out here. Not for survey work, just to call. She looked up at him then. Her dark eyes in the lamplight were complicated, the way deep water is complicated, more going on beneath the surface than you can see from outside. That would be a thing for people to talk about, she said. People in Harlan Creek will talk about anything, he said. I don't much mind what people talk about. I have 4 children, she said. I know, I like your children. The farm is 60 acres of clay soil in the 3rd year of a drought, she said. I can see that. I am 32 years old and I have not had time to be anything but a farmer and a mother in 3 years, she said, and this time her voice had an edge to it that was not quite defensive and not quite raw but was something close to both. Eudora, he said, and she stopped. I'm 34. I've spent 7 years riding all over Texas, being very good at measuring land and not very good at anything else that matters. I'm not looking for something easy or perfect. I'm looking for something real. She was quiet for a long time. The lamp flickered again. Harriet's story in the other room had apparently reached a climactic moment. You can come to Sunday supper, Eudora said finally. We eat at 5. He rode back to town in the Texas dark with the stars overhead so dense and bright they seemed to be pressing down toward the earth, and he was whistling something under his breath without quite knowing he was doing it. He came to Sunday supper. He came the following Sunday too, and the one after that. In October the heat finally broke in the proper way of Texas autumn, the evenings going cool and sharp, the mornings carrying a clarity that summer had stolen. Gilbert had finished his survey work, submitted his reports to the county land office, and begun planning whether to take another contract in the next county east or to find something that would keep him closer to Harlan Creek. He and Eudora settled into a habit. Sunday supper, which the children began to expect and prepare for with varying degrees of enthusiasm, from George's guileless delight to Clara's careful watchfulness. And on Wednesday afternoons, if the weather was decent, Gilbert would come by ostensibly to help with whatever heavy work needed doing, because there was always heavy work that needed doing and Eudora could not refuse practical help on practical grounds without being foolish about it, and she was not a foolish woman. He learned to work alongside her without interfering with her methods. She had systems for everything, developed through necessity and refined through repetition, and he learned quickly that the worst thing he could do was suggest a better way, not because she was prideful, but because her ways were in fact usually the best available given the resources she had. What she needed was not direction but additional hands, and he provided those without commentary. They talked while they worked. About the drought, which the old-timers in the county were beginning to say might break by winter if the weather patterns held. About the political situation in Austin, which Eudora had opinions on that were considerably more progressive than most people in Harlan Creek, including on the subject of the Reconstruction and the situation of freed black families in the county who were facing a different and brutal set of difficulties that Eudora found unconscionable and said so directly. Gilbert agreed with her, which she had not entirely expected, and this agreement opened something between them that went deeper than the practical conversations they'd been having. Thomas was indifferent to it, she said once carefully as they mended fence posts in the October light. Not hostile, just indifferent. He thought justice was something that happened slowly and that you shouldn't push. She drove a nail with 3 precise blows. I was never able to make myself indifferent to things that were wrong. That's a hard way to move through the world, he said. Better than the alternative, she said. He watched her hands on the hammer, capable and sure. I think, he said slowly, that you have been carrying so much for so long that you've forgotten you're allowed to set some of it down. She looked at him over the fence post. What would I set down? Maybe not the responsibility, he said. I don't think you could set that down even if you tried, but maybe the weight of doing it entirely alone. She drove another nail. The sound rang out across the dry, flat land. Gilbert, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed. He did not point it out, but he noticed. I am not looking for someone to carry things for me. I know you're not, he said. I'm looking to carry things beside you. There's a difference. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, hand me the next post. He handed it to her. She said it without assistance. But when he held the wire while she stapled it, he felt her fingers brush his for just a moment, one brief unguarded second, before she moved on. November came, and with it the first real clouds, the kind that built in the south and moved with genuine intent rather than the teasing false promises of the dry years. Dobbs, who knew weather the way men who work outside come to know weather, looked at the sky on a Thursday morning and said he thought they might actually get rain before the month was out. He was right. On the 14th of November, the rain came. It came at first gently, a soft, steady falling that the cracked earth received with what felt almost like a sigh of relief. By afternoon it was proper rain, soaking into the ground, filling the water barrel in the Winslow farmyard, pooling in the low places. The kitchen garden, which Eudora had been keeping alive by sheer hauling effort, drank it in. The pasture, brown and exhausted, began to look, by the time the rain stopped the following morning, faintly, almost tentatively, green at the edges. Gilbert was in town when it started. He thought about Eudora all through the afternoon rain, imagined her standing in her farmyard with her face turned up to the sky, the way people who have been waiting for a thing for 3 years receive it when it finally comes. He thought about it, and then found that thinking about it was not enough, and the following morning, before the mud on the road had even begun to dry, he rode out to the farm. She was in the garden when he arrived, on her knees in the wet earth, pressing her hands into the mud with an expression on her face that he had not seen before. Not grief, not exhaustion. Something opened and wide and vulnerable that she had not let him see previously. She heard him come through the gate and looked up. Her hands were muddy to the wrist. Her hair had escaped entirely from its pins and there were tears on her face, though she was not quite crying, more like the tears were arriving without her permission. He dismounted and tied Solomon to the post and walked over and crouched down beside her in the mud. It rained, she said unnecessarily. It rained, he agreed. The ground is wet, she said. Her voice was strange, thinned out. I put my hands in it and it's actually wet. Not just damp, actually wet. Yes, he said. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob but contained both. 3 years, she said. Gilbert. 3 years. And without thinking about it, because the moment did not invite thought, he reached out and covered her muddy hands with his. They're in the wet garden in the November mud, and he held them. She let him. That was the thing. She let him, and after a moment she curled her fingers up through his in the mud, and they stayed there like that, kneeling in the November garden, while the pale, wet light of a post-rain morning spread across the 60 acres of clay soil that was, finally, receiving what it needed. 3 years, he said quietly, and you kept them fed. Barely, she said. You kept them fed, he repeated. All 4 of them through 3 dry years, alone. Shook her head, looking at the muddy garden bed, but he felt her hands tighten on his. Eudora, he said, what you have done is extraordinary. She looked at him then sharply with the reflexive rebuttal already in her eyes, the practiced deflection of a woman who has been told too often that her survival is simply what people do, that it doesn't merit particular notice. He looked back at her steadily. What you've done, he said again, quietly and with complete conviction, is extraordinary. The feeding of them, yes, but also the manner of it, the way Clara knows this land, the way Samuel thinks about mathematics, the way George asks questions like the world is worth knowing. The way Harriet lives so entirely inside her imagination that she hasn't been ground down by any of the grinding. You did that through 3 years of drought, and you did it without anyone calling it remarkable because nobody was paying attention. He paused. I'm paying attention. The tears that had been hovering came properly then, not the theatrical tears of grief, but the practical tears of a woman who has been holding a great deal in a very small container for a very long time and has just been offered a slightly larger container. She didn't hide them, which told him something. She simply let them run down her face while she looked at him. I don't know what to do with that, she said finally. You don't have to do anything with it, he said. I just wanted you to know that someone has noticed. She pulled one hand free from his and pressed it, muddy as it was, against her cheek, and then she looked at him with an expression that was still raw and open and entirely honest. Gilbert, she said, I am 32 years old and I have 4 children and 60 acres of clay in a drought county, and the last time I let myself feel anything that was not directly productive I was 28 and Thomas was still alive. I know, he said. I don't know how to do this, she said. I don't know that it requires knowing how, he said. I think it mostly requires deciding whether you want to. A long pause. The wet garden sparkled in the morning light. From inside the house he could hear the sound of children beginning to stir, the particular cacophony of a household waking up. I think, she said slowly, that I might want to. He smiled at her there in the mud. Good, he said. What followed was the kind of courtship that happens between practical people. Which is to say, it was not much like the courtship described in the novels Eudora had read in Virginia, and very much like the actual daily life of 2 adults who were still figuring out something entirely new, while the world kept demanding its ordinary attentions. He came more often, not only Sundays and Wednesdays but Saturdays too, and sometimes on a weekday evening when the days grew shorter and the work of the farm consolidated itself. The children adjusted to his presence in their various ways. George adopted him completely and without reservation, which was the uncomplicated gift of a 5-year-old. Harriet incorporated him into her interior narratives as a figure of some importance. Samuel began bringing him mathematical and structural problems to consider, and the 2 of them could spend an entire Saturday morning discussing the engineering of fence construction or the principles behind water diversion that might help the kitchen garden. Clara remained the last to yield, watching, always watching, but Gilbert was patient with her wariness because he understood what it meant. She was protecting her mother from a threat she could not fully assess, and this was the behavior of a good daughter who had earned the right to be cautious. It was Clara who finally crossed the last reservation in her own way, on a Saturday in late November when Gilbert arrived to find Eudora down with a winter cold, the kind that settled in the chest and stole your voice and energy together. Eudora was furious about it in the efficient way she was furious about anything that interfered with work, but she was genuinely unwell, the kind of unwell that even she could not work through, And she was in the house doing the minimum while Clara was trying to manage the morning chores, and Samuel was helping, and George was underfoot, and Harriet was describing to Patience the milk cow the details of a story she was composing. Gilbert came through the gate, assessed the situation with the quickness of someone who has spent 7 years reading complex terrain, and without asking direction, he went to the barn and began the feeding routine he had watched often enough to know by memory. He fed Job the mule and Patience the cow, and the 3 chickens drew water, mended a gate latch that had been giving trouble, and was splitting wood for the stove when Clara appeared. She stood watching him for a moment. "She didn't ask you to come today," Clara said. "I know," he said, setting another piece of wood on the block. "I came anyway." "She won't like feeling like she needs help," Clara said. "She doesn't need to like it," he said. "She needs firewood and clean water, and for the barn to be sorted while she rests. Whether she likes that I'm the one providing it doesn't change whether it needs doing." Another of Clara's long pauses. "I've been watching you," she said. "I know," he said. "You don't do things to make her grateful," she said. "Some men do things to make you feel like you owe them." "A person who does a kindness to create a debt isn't doing a kindness," Gilbert said. "They're making an investment. Those are different things." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She smiles more now when she talks about you." He set down the splitting axe. "Does she?" "She doesn't know she's doing it," Clara said. "She'd probably be annoyed if I told her." A pause. "She deserves someone who sees how remarkable she is. We see it. But we're her children, so of course we see it." A pause longer than the others. "I'm glad you see it." He looked at this 12-year-old child, this small serious keeper of her mother's dignity, and felt something that was equal parts respect and tenderness. "Thank you, Clara," he said. "I'm glad too." She nodded once sharply, the matter settled. "I'll make the corn bread if you finish the wood," she said, and went back inside. When he brought in the first armload of wood, Eudora was sitting at the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket, looking approximately as annoyed as Clara had predicted, and considerably paler than her usual weather-browned self. "You didn't have to come," she said, her voice roughened. "I know," he said, setting the wood by the stove. "I could have managed," she said. "Of course you could have," he said. "You always can, that's not the question." She looked at him over the blanket, her dark eyes reddened at the rims. "Then what is the question?" "The question," he said, crouching by the stove to build up the fire, "is whether managing is the only option available, or whether occasionally there's someone willing to manage alongside you." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Outside he could hear George earnestly telling the chickens something at length. Harriet had apparently moved her story from Patience to Job. "Gilbert," Eudora said, and something in her voice was different. Softer in a way that the cold had something to do with but was not entirely attributable to the cold. "Why are you here? Really? What are you getting out of being here on a cold November morning doing my barn chores?" He looked at her across the small kitchen. The fire was beginning to catch. The room smelled of wood smoke and the last of the coffee and the particular smell of a sick person who hasn't quite surrendered to being sick. "I am getting," he said, "a morning spent near someone I am in love with. That is what I am getting." The word hung in the air between them. She stared at him. He held her gaze and did not take it back, because it was true and he had known it was true for several weeks and saw no particular reason to keep quiet about it. "You're in love with me," she repeated, as if testing the syllables. "Yes," he said. "I have a head cold and I'm wearing a blanket and I haven't done my hair and my farm is 60 acres of clay," she said. "All of that remains true," he said. "Gilbert," she said, and her voice cracked a little, which may have been the cold but may not have been. "You don't have to say anything back," he said. "I'm not asking for anything right now. I just thought you should know." She looked at him for a long time. Fire was going properly now, the room beginning to warm. Through the window the November morning was pale and cold and beautiful in the stripped-down way of Texas in autumn. "I think," she said slowly, and her voice was careful in the way of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain by feel, "that I am in the process of falling in love with you too. I am not there yet, perhaps, Or perhaps I am and I simply haven't admitted it until this moment." She paused. "That is the most honest thing I can tell you." "It is enough," he said. "It is more than enough." She tucked the blanket more securely around herself and looked at the fire. "We are being very sensible about this," she said. "Are we?" He said, "I think so," she said. "Two adults being honest about something large and uncertain and terrifying. That seems sensible to me." "I've been called worse than sensible," he said. She made the sound again, the one that was almost a laugh, and this time it was more laugh than not. He brought her tea and sat across from her, and they talked for 2 hours while Clara made corn bread and Samuel sorted grain and George came in periodically to report on the chickens, and Harriet wrote verses about the rain on a piece of paper. She then presented to Eudora as a gift. By the time he left in the late afternoon, the fire was stoked, the wood box was full, and Eudora Winslow was asleep in the chair by the stove with her hands in her lap, and the first truly restful expression he had seen on her face since the morning in the muddy garden. December came in cold and the rain came again, not the drought-breaking deluge of wishful thinking but steady, reliable rain, twice a week, enough to saturate and settle, enough to promise a proper spring. The farmers in the county felt the change in the air and in the soil. Plans began to be made, wheat seed discussed, the year's prospects analyzed with cautious optimism at the general store and the barber shop, and wherever men gathered to discuss what the land was likely to do. Eudora bought wheat seed in December. She had saved for it through the fall, the small savings of a woman who knows how to make $1 do $3 of work, and she bought exactly enough to plant the south field and half the east field, which was her calculation of what she could actually manage with her current resources. She told Gilbert about this plan on a Sunday supper, laying it out with the practical specificity she brought to everything, and he listened carefully and then asked 2 questions about soil preparation, questions that she answered knowledgeably, and then they sat in comfortable, productive silence for a moment, the way people who understand each other can. "I'll need help with the planting," she said finally. "Samuel is strong for his age, but there's more than the 2 of us can manage efficiently." "I'll be here," he said. She looked at him. "Gilbert, you've been here nearly every week since August. The county survey is long finished. Have you taken any other contracts?" "I've been considering one in the next county," he said carefully, "but I haven't accepted it." "You should accept it," she said. "You can't live on generosity. The work needs doing." "The work needs doing," he agreed, "but so does the planting come February." "By February the contract would be finished?" she asked. "If I started in January," he said. "Yes," she nodded, processing this. "All right, but Gilbert," she met his eyes across the table. "Don't put your life on indefinite hold on my account. I won't have that." "It's not on hold," he said. "I'm deciding what I want my life to look like. That's different from putting it on hold." She considered this. "And what do you want it to look like?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. George had fallen asleep at the table in the way of small children abruptly and completely, and Samuel had carried him to the other room. Clara and Harriet were doing dishes with the economical noises of a well-practiced routine. "I want it to look like this," Gilbert said. "This table, this farm, these children, you." She looked at her coffee cup. Her jaw was tight in a way that meant she was moved and was not certain what to do with being moved. "You'd stay in Harlan Creek," she said. It was not quite a question. "There's land work all over this county," he said. "Plenty to keep a surveyor employed. And I've been thinking about property too. There's a small parcel available northwest of town, a house that needs work and 12 acres, manageable on a surveyor's income." "You've been looking at property," she said, in a tone that was not entirely neutral. "A man thinking about his future looks at what a future might consist of," he said. She looked at him directly then. "Gilbert, I am not a woman who does things halfway or in an impractical manner. I have 4 children and a farm, and I have worked very hard to keep all of that intact. If you are telling me that you are thinking about a future here in Harlan Creek near this farm, I need you to be entirely clear about what that future looks like in your mind. because I am not in a position to have my heart altered by a half-intention. Eudora, he said, I am telling you that what I want is to court you properly, for as long as you need, and to ask you to marry me when you are ready to say yes. I want to be a part of this family. I want to help raise these children. I want to work this land alongside you and sleep under this roof, and watch the wheat come up in the south field when the rain holds. That is what I am telling you. The silence that followed was complete. Clara's voice from the other room said something to Harriet, and Harriet's voice responded, and neither of them knew what had just been said in the kitchen. I am not ready to say yes tonight, Eudora said. Her voice was steady and deliberate and entirely serious. I know, he said, but I am not saying no, she said. I know that too, he said. She reached across the table and laid her hand briefly on his, just for a moment, warm and certain. Go do your work in the next county, she said. Come back in February. We'll plant the south field. He left for the next county in January, and the 3 weeks he was away were longer than the entire previous 3 years of his adult life. He wrote to her twice, practical letters about survey conditions and weather patterns, because he knew she would appreciate practical information more than declarations, and she wrote back once, a letter about the farm preparations and the children, and, at the very end, a single sentence that he read 4 times. I find that I am looking forward to February with an intensity that is not entirely about the wheat planting. He rode back into Harlan Creek on the 1st of February, 1879, with the packet contract money in his saddlebag, a sense of purpose that was entirely new in its particulars, and 3 weeks of understanding what it meant to want to be somewhere specific. He went straight to the Winslow farm. She was in the south field, marking the rows with stakes and string when he came through the gate. She heard Solomon's hooves on the frozen ground and turned, and for one unguarded second before she controlled her expression, her face did something open and warm and entirely lovely. You're back, she said. I'm back, he said. He tied Solomon to the post and walked out to the field, and she handed him a stake without preamble. Hold that end, she said. I need to get this row straight before the light goes. He held the stake and she pulled the string taut, and they measured the first row of what would be the south field's wheat crop together in the cold February afternoon light. When the row was marked, she coiled the string and looked at him. How was the work? She asked. Good, he said. County East has more disputed parcels than expected. I could have contracts there for years. But you didn't commit to more, she said. No, he said. Because of Harlan Creek, she said. Because of a woman on 60 acres of clay who writes letters with useful information, and a single sentence at the end that a man thinks about every day for 3 weeks, he said. She did not quite look away, but her chin dipped forward in the way it did when she was deciding how much of herself to let show. I have been thinking, she said, in the careful voice of someone who has done a great deal of thinking and is now ready to report the results, about what you said in December, about what you wanted your future to look like. Yes, he said. I have been thinking, she continued, that I have spent 3 years being entirely alone and entirely capable and entirely determined not to need anyone. And I have been thinking that there is a particular kind of pride in that which has been useful to me, but which has also been, perhaps, slightly dishonest. Because the truth is that there were many mornings when I was hauling water before dawn, and I wished, very specifically, that there was someone beside me to carry the other bucket. Not to carry both buckets. I was never wishing for that. Just someone beside me with the other bucket. He looked at her in the cold February light, the woman who had kept 4 children fed through 3 dry years, who had rechinked her own walls and patched her own roof and shot rattlesnakes off fence posts and made extraordinary corn bread and raised extraordinary children and never cried where anyone could see her. Eudora, he said. I am ready to say yes, she said, if you are still asking. He stepped toward her in the frozen south field and took both her hands in his, right there among the planting stakes and the coiled string, and she did not pull back. I am still asking, he said. She looked at him for a long, full moment, and then the last piece of the careful reserve she had been carrying for 3 years came down, and she stepped forward into his arms, and he held her in the February field while the cold wind moved through the south pasture, and somewhere in the farmyard job, the mule expressed an opinion about something with considerable volume. She laughed. Properly laughed, startled out of the serious moment by the mule's commentary, and the laugh was wonderful, unguarded and warm and entirely Eudora, and he held her and laughed too, and they stood there in the cold field in the midwinter light, two practical adults who had come to love each other in the most practical and impractical ways at once. They were married in March. Harlan Creek did not have a formal church, but it had a minister who came through on the first Sunday of each month, a Methodist circuit rider named Reverend Gates, who was thin as a rail and had the weathered look of a man who had spent 30 years in open country. He conducted the ceremony in the Winslow farmyard on a cool, clear March morning, with the children arranged in front of him, and approximately 20 people from the surrounding farms, and the town who had come partly out of goodwill and partly out of curiosity. Eudora wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that Clara had pressed with tremendous solemnity the night before. She had done her hair properly, which was unusual enough that George stared at her for several seconds with his mouth open. Gilbert stood beside her in the suit he had purchased in San Antonio 3 weeks before, dark and well-fitted, and he looked at her when she came out of the house and across the yard with a steadiness in his eyes that did not waver for an instant. She had expected to feel nervous. She had been nervous at her first wedding at 22, giddy and nervous and certain and young. This was different. Standing beside Gilbert in the farmyard with Reverend Gates reading the words and her children watching, and the March wind moving across the dry grass at the field edge, she felt something that was not the giddiness of youth, but was something quieter and more absolute. Certain in the way that a well-built thing is certain. Sure. When Reverend Gates asked Gilbert whether he took this woman, Gilbert said, "I do," in the voice of a man who means exactly what he says. When the Reverend asked Eudora whether she took this man, she looked at Gilbert and said, "I do," in the voice of a woman who has weighed the question from every angle and arrived at a conclusion that will hold. Clara was crying, which she would later deny. Samuel shook Gilbert's hand with great formality. Harriet presented them with a poem she had composed for the occasion that rhymed forever with endeavor and clever, and was, by the assessment of everyone present, genuinely touching. George hugged Gilbert's knees and said, "Are you our father now?" And Gilbert crouched down and said, "If you'll have me." And George said yes, with the kind of simple conviction that only a 5-year-old can bring to a large question. That evening, after the guests had gone and the children were in bed, Gilbert and Eudora sat at the kitchen table with the oil lamp low and the quiet of the farm around them, the specific quiet of a late March night in Texas when the wind has settled. "Well," said Eudora. "Well," said Gilbert. She looked at him across the table. "I am not sure I know what to do with the feeling of not being alone," she said. "I expect it takes some adjustment," he said. "I've been trying to identify it," she said. "The feeling, it's odd, not unwelcome. It is actually quite welcome, but odd." "What does it feel like?" he asked. She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "Like setting down a water bucket," she said finally. "Not because someone is taking it, but because there is somewhere solid to set it down." He reached across the table and took her hand, which by now was a familiar gesture, no longer tentative. She turned her hand in his and held it properly. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said back, in the practical tone of someone stating a well-established fact. He smiled. "You make it sound like a land survey measurement." "It is approximately as certain," she said. He laughed, and she smiled, the smile that had been growing more frequent since November and was by now entirely natural on her face, and they sat there in the kitchen of the farmhouse that she had patched and rechinked and maintained through 3 dry years, and it was full of people now, 4 sleeping children and 2 wide-awake adults, and the lamp burned steadily. Spring came in properly. The wheat Gilbert and Eudora and Samuel planted in the south field and half the east field came up green and thick, the best growth the soil had produced since Thomas Winslow had first turned it 8 years before. The rains continued, not dramatically, but reliably, twice a week, steady and sufficient. The kitchen garden overflowed. Patience the cow produced more milk than she had in 2 years. Even Job the mule seemed to carry himself with slightly less existential weight. Gilbert had taken a contract with the county that kept him local, resurveying parcels in the district that had been disputed for years. A job that would take the better part of 12 months and paid a decent wage. He worked 6 days a week and came home to the Winslow farm in the evenings, which had become home in the way of something that always should have been what it was. He and Samuel built a new barn section in April, proper timber frame construction that Samuel designed from measurements he'd calculated himself, which Gilbert reviewed and found entirely sound. The boy had a talent that needed feeding, and they had begun a correspondence with the school in Beaumont about admission and requirements for the following year. Harriet, who had always lived inside her head, began under Eudora's careful encouragement to write her stories down, and she produced, by May, a bound notebook full of tales that ranged from the plausible to the extravagant, but all had a vivid energy that made you want to know what happened next. Clara, who was 13 now and had spent the better part of a year watching Gilbert with the vigilance of someone protecting something precious, had arrived by April at a place that was not quite ease but was something close to it. She still watched, because watching was Clara's nature, but the watching was no longer assessment. It was more like learning, observing the mechanics of something she had not had a model for. One evening in May she asked Gilbert a question while he was working at the table on survey notes. "Did you know, when you came out to survey the fence lines last August, that you were going to end up here?" He looked up at her, 13 years old and already asking the questions that would follow her for life. "No," he said honestly. "I knew that your mother was a remarkable person within about 3 minutes of meeting her, but I didn't know what that meant yet." "What changed?" she asked. He thought about it. "I kept coming back," he said. "Every day I came back, and every day she was more of herself, and more of herself was more remarkable than the day before. There wasn't a single moment. It was more like a tide coming in, a lot of small moments that added up to something unavoidable." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I understand that," in a tone that suggested she was filing it away carefully. "Thank you." She went back to her book. He went back to his survey notes. The kitchen was warm. From the other room came the murmur of Eudora reading to George. The same nightly ritual she had maintained through every difficult year, reading by the oil lamp until George was asleep, her voice steady and present. In June, Eudora told him that she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, before the day started, matter-of-factly in the way she always told him important things, standing in the kitchen with her coffee. He looked at her, and then he stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and held her, and she let herself be held, which she had gotten considerably better at over the past months. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired," she said, "but not the bad kind of tired. The kind that means something is happening." "Are you pleased?" he asked carefully. She pulled back enough to look at him. "I am 33 years old, Gilbert. I have 4 children already. I am going to be a very large woman in the heat of a Texas summer. I am also," she said, and the almost smile became a proper smile, "entirely pleased." He kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then her mouth, and she put her hands against his chest in the way she had, settled and sure. The pregnancy went well through the summer and into the fall. Eudora, who had done this 4 times before, approached it with characteristic efficiency and very little drama, adjusting her work schedule where necessary and refusing to adjust it where unnecessary. Gilbert, who had never had a child before and was privately astounded by the whole proceeding, was careful to be useful without hovering, which was the precise balance Eudora required. The harvest of the South Field wheat in September was the finest the farm had produced in 4 years. The stalks stood tall in the field, and the yield was strong, not miraculous but solid, the kind of yield that means the farm will carry through winter with some to spare. Eudora stood at the field edge when the cutting was done and looked at it for a long time, and Gilbert stood beside her, and neither of them said anything, because the moment did not need words. On the 2nd of November 1879, almost exactly 1 year after the rains had come back, and Eudora had knelt in the mud with tears on her face, Gilbert Barnett and Eudora Winslow's first child together was born. He was born in the farmhouse, delivered by Dr. Prescott, who was, on this occasion, entirely sober, and attended by Mrs. Albright from the boarding house, who had appointed herself as a practical midwife some years before. Gilbert waited in the kitchen with 4 children in varying states of anxiety, Samuel sitting straight and still in the way he processed things, Clara moving between the door and the table and the window in tight circuits, Harriet composing something quietly in her notebook, and George sitting on Gilbert's lap asking questions that Gilbert answered as accurately and calmly as he could. The baby was healthy and loud, announcing his arrival with a fury that carried clearly through the farmhouse walls, and Dr. Prescott came out of the bedroom looking satisfied. "You have a son," he said, "both doing very well." George announced this was the best news he had ever received. Clara pressed her hands over her mouth. Samuel exhaled. Harriet wrote something with great speed in her notebook. Gilbert sat in the kitchen for a moment after the doctor had gone back in, looking at the 4 children of a woman he loved completely, the 4 he had not made but had chosen, and he felt something that had no name precise enough, only the general shape of a life that had become exactly what it was supposed to be. When Dr. Prescott came out and told him he could come in, he went. Eudora was tired in the complete way of someone who has done enormous physical work, leaning against the pillows with her hair down around her shoulders, and she was holding a son wrapped in a blanket, and she looked up when Gilbert came in with an expression that was so entirely open and so entirely herself that he had to stop in the doorway for a moment. He went and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby. "He has your coloring," she said. He did. Auburn-haired, red in the thin baby way of newborn hair, with the dark eyes that might change or might not. "What shall we call him?" Gilbert asked. Eudora looked at the baby for a moment. "Thomas would have liked you," she said, as if completing a private conversation she'd been having. Then she looked at Gilbert. "I was thinking James Thomas Barnett, if that's acceptable to you." "It's more than acceptable," he said. "It's perfect." She settled back against the pillows with the baby against her chest, and Gilbert sat beside them, and after a moment he put his arm around her shoulders very gently and she leaned into him, which was the most complete thing she knew how to do. "Eudora," he said. She said, eyes closing. 3 years ago you were hauling water before dawn and mending your own roof and keeping 4 children fed in a drought," he said quietly. "Do you remember how you described what you did? You said the math was simple." "I remember," she said, not opening her eyes. "The math was never simple," he said. "What you did was extraordinary. What you still do every day is extraordinary. I need you to know that I will never stop thinking so." She was quiet for a moment. The baby made a small sound. Somewhere in the kitchen he could hear the children beginning to argue quietly about something, the comfortable argument of people who are safe enough to disagree. "Gilbert," she said, and her voice was sleepy and warm and entirely steady, "you are a very good man." "I'm trying," he said. "You are succeeding," she said. And then, because she was Eudora, she added, "Do not let it go to your head." He laughed softly, and she smiled without opening her eyes, and James Thomas Barnett slept against his mother's chest with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a newborn who does not yet know anything about drought or hard years or clay soil or the cost of survival, and does not need to. The following spring, the county completed the rail survey that Eudora had been following for 2 years, and the line came through 30 miles south, which was almost exactly the scenario she had calculated as most favorable for freight transport. She began making plans to increase wheat production across a 3rd field. She also began talking with 2 neighboring farms about cooperative grain storage, because she had worked out that shared storage reduced individual costs enough to make the difference between a marginal year and a profitable one. The neighboring farmers, both men who had spent 30 years in the habit of not taking instruction from women, sat across from her and her numbers at the kitchen table and found, somewhat to their surprise, that the numbers were entirely correct. Where did she learn all this? One of them asked Gilbert afterward. She read everything she could get her hands on, Gilbert said, for 3 years with no one to talk to, and she has an exceptional mind. He was not modest about it. It had never seemed to him that there was anything to be modest about. Samuel went to school in Beaumont that fall, at 11 years old, after a year of preparing and correspondence, and the saving of the tuition costs by both Gilbert and Eudora together. He went with 2 notebooks already full of mathematical ideas he wanted to discuss with someone qualified to understand them. He wrote home twice a week, letters that were technically informative and subtly full of the particular loneliness and excitement of a child who has finally found his intellectual level. Clara, at 14, was helping Eudora manage the farm's bookkeeping in a way that suggested she would be a formidable businesswoman. She had decided she wanted to teach, which was one of the few professional paths clearly open to women of her generation, but she intended to teach mathematics, specifically, because she had inherited from her mother and absorbed from Gilbert the understanding that numbers were not just tools, but a language for understanding the world. Harriet continued to write. Her notebooks multiplied. Eudora got her a proper writing desk for Christmas, salvaged from the general store and refinished, and Harriet looked at it with an expression that suggested she was already composing something worthy of it. George, at 6, had decided that he was going to be a horse doctor. This ambition changed weekly but had been consistent for 3 months, which was a record. James, who was called Jamie by everyone, grew at the rate all babies grow, which is to say faster than seems possible, and had by spring become a fat, serious baby with his father's auburn-tinged hair and his mother's measuring eyes, and the ability to charm every single person who entered the farmyard. On a warm evening in April of 1880, Gilbert and Eudora sat on the porch of the farmhouse after the children were in bed, the spring Texas night soft around them, the south field and the east field both planted, and the northwest sky holding the last light of a long day. Patience was settled in the barn. Job had been unusually placid. The wheat was 2 inches above the ground in the south field, green and straight. Eudora was nursing Jamie, who was 6 months old and conducting nursing with his characteristic seriousness. Gilbert sat beside her with his coffee, shoulder to shoulder, watching the evening come down. "I have been thinking," Eudora said. "That's generally true," he said. "I have been thinking about the Hartley parcel," she said. "The one that went up for sale last month. It borders our east field, 12 acres of soil that's actually better than ours if you put the right work into it." "I know the parcel," he said. "I surveyed it in 1878. If we bought it," she said, "we could extend the east field by 1/3 and plant alfalfa in rotation with the wheat. Alfalfa fixes nitrogen in the soil. It would improve the wheat yield in subsequent years without additional fertilizer cost." She paused. "I've been reading about soil management in a journal that the Agricultural Extension in Austin has started distributing." He looked at her in the evening light. "You want to expand the farm?" "I want to build something," she said. "Something that lasts, something the children inherit that is worth inheriting." "The Hartley parcel price is high," he said. "I know. I've been calculating. Between my wheat sale income this year and your survey contracts, if we apply the surplus together over 2 seasons, we can make the purchase by spring of 1882 without undue strain." She adjusted Jamie, who was falling asleep with the complete efficiency of a well-fed baby. "I've written it out, the numbers work." "May I see the numbers?" he asked. "They're on the table inside," she said. "I did them twice to make sure." He had no doubt that she had done them twice and that they were correct. He had known her for nearly 2 years and he had never seen her present a calculation that was wrong. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." She turned to look at him, slightly surprised that it was that simple. "Your numbers work," he said, "and you have been right about every land decision you've made in 8 years on this farm. Why would I argue?" She looked at him for a moment with the dark eyes that he had loved since August of 1878, warm and intelligent and no longer carrying quite the same weight of solitude they had then. "Most men would want to make that decision themselves," she said. "I'm not most men," he said. "You told me that yourself. In November of 1878, you said, 'No, I'm beginning to see that.'" She looked genuinely surprised that he had remembered. "I remember everything you say," he said. "I'm a land surveyor. Exact measurements are my profession." She shook her head slowly, half exasperated and half laughing, and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her and the sleeping baby. And the evening came down over the Winslow Barnett farm in Harlan Creek, Texas, warm and quiet, and full of the specific peace of a place where hard things have happened and good things have been built on the far side of them. The south field was green. The east field was greening. The kitchen garden was overflowing. There were books in a crate by the fire and notebooks on the writing desk and letters from Samuel in Beaumont, and a plan for the Hartley parcel written out in Eudora's precise hand on the kitchen table. There was a mule named Job who had apparently decided to stop being quite so long-suffering, and a cow named Patience who had enough milk now for the family and the neighbors, and seemingly still more milk beyond that. There was a baby sleeping against his mother's shoulder, with complete confidence in the world. There was a woman who had carried 4 children through 3 dry years and come out the other side not broken but clarified, knowing exactly who she was and what she could do and what she wanted. And there was a man sitting beside her in the April evening who had ridden into Harlan Creek in August of 1878 to measure some fence lines, and had instead found the most remarkable woman he had ever encountered, and who intended to spend the rest of his life saying so. "Gilbert," Eudora said. He said, "you know what I've been thinking about lately. The Hartley parcel alfalfa rotation," he said. "Besides that," she said. "What?" he said. She was quiet for a moment, watching the last light in the northwest sky. "I've been thinking about that morning in the muddy garden," she said. "After the first rain, when you came and you held my muddy hands and you said what you said." "What did I say?" he asked, though he knew. "You said what I had done was extraordinary," she said. "You were the first person to say it, the first person who had noticed." "You deserved to have it noticed," he said. "I know," she said. "I know that now." She paused. 3 years ago I wouldn't have believed it. I would have said it was simply what had to be done. And I would have been right about that, but I would have been missing something important. "What were you missing?" he said. "That something can be both necessary and extraordinary," she said. "That surviving is not diminished by being required. That what you do because you have no choice can still be remarkable." She paused again. "I was so insistent on making it ordinary, because if it was ordinary it didn't cost anything. If it was extraordinary then it meant the cost was real, and for 3 years I couldn't afford to feel the cost." He was quiet, listening to her in the way he always listened to her, with complete attention. "You made it safe to let it be extraordinary," she said. "That's what you did. That morning in the garden and all the mornings after it. You made it safe to admit that it was hard." He pressed his lips to her temple, gently, so as not to wake Jamie. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said, in that practical certain tone that he had come to know was the most genuine declaration he had ever heard from anyone. The stars were coming out over Texas, the same impossible density of stars that had kept him company on 7 years of riding alone across the state, but they looked different now, the way everything looks different when you are looking at it from a place you have chosen and are choosing still. The farm was quiet. The children were sleeping. The wheat was growing. And the woman beside him had her head on his shoulder and a baby against her chest, and a plan for 12 acres of alfalfa, and a heart that had opened again after being held very carefully shut for 3 necessary years, and was open still, and intended to remain so. In August of 1881, Eudora delivered their second child together, a girl they named Alice, who arrived with the same red-tinged hair as Jamie and an expression of profound assessment that suggested she had inherited the family's evaluative eye. The purchase of the Hartley parcel went through in March of 1882, exactly on the timeline Eudora had calculated. The alfalfa went in that spring. Samuel came home from Beaumont for the summer with a certificate of advanced mathematical study and the kind of confidence that comes from 3 years of being understood. He was 14 and already corresponding with an engineering firm in Galveston about future apprenticeship possibilities. Clara began teaching mathematics at the Harlan Creek Schoolhouse in the fall of 1882, at 16, which was young but not impossible in a county that had more children than teachers, and she did it with the same steady, systematic care she brought to everything. Her students learned. Harriet's first story was published in a women's literary paper out of San Antonio in 1883. The editor wrote that it was one of the most vivid pieces of frontier writing he had received and asked for more. Harriet was 15 and received this news with a serenity that suggested she had simply been waiting for the world to catch up with what she already knew. George decided, definitively, at the age of 9, that he was going to be a veterinarian. This decision did not change. And Gilbert Barnett rode out every morning to his survey work in the county, which kept him busy enough and paid well enough, and came home every evening to a farmhouse that was, by the standards of Harlan Creek in 1883, reasonably prosperous. The south field and the east field and the alfalfa and the Hartley parcel made up a farm that was working the way farms are supposed to work, giving back to the soil and receiving from it in the old patient cycle. He sat on the porch one evening in late summer, the same porch, the same April to autumn rhythm of Texas weather, with 2-year-old Alice in his lap and Jamie, who was 4 and had opinions about everything, sitting on the steps with a stick and some serious purpose. From inside came the sound of Eudora finishing the supper dishes, the particular rhythm of her movement that he knew as well as any sound in the world. She came out with her own coffee and sat beside him, and Alice immediately climbed from his lap to hers, and he let her go because Eudora was always more comfortable when she was holding someone. "Good day," she asked. "The Malone boundary dispute is finally settled," he said. "Should have been settled 5 years ago. There was no actual dispute, just 2 men who disliked each other and needed a reason." "Land disputes are almost never about land," she said. "No," he agreed. "Are you tired?" "Yes," she said. "The good kind," he smiled. "You've been saying that more often, the good kind." "I've been feeling it more often," she said simply. Across the yard, the south field was going golden in the late summer, the wheat weeks from harvest, standing tall in the last long light of the day. The farm was quiet in the particular way of late summer evenings, the work done, the animals settled, the children in various states of winding down. Job the mule was in the pasture. Patience the cow was in the barn. 3 chickens had become 8. And Eudora Winslow, who was Eudora Barnett now, sat on the porch of her farmhouse with her daughter in her arms and her husband beside her and her 4 older children variously in the world building their own extraordinary things, and the Harlan Creek evening settled around all of it like something earned. "Gilbert," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you know what I was thinking this morning, when I was in the garden before dawn?" "Before dawn," he said. "Old habit," she said with the almost smile. "What were you thinking?" he said. She looked at the golden south field in the last light. "I was thinking that I am exactly where I am supposed to be," she said. "I was thinking that every difficult thing brought me here, and I was thinking that here is quite extraordinary." He looked at her. She turned and looked at him. "Yes," he said, "it is." She leaned against him in the August evening with Alice sleeping in her arms and the south field gold before them and the whole long particular life of a farm and a family spread out around them in all directions, past and present and forward. And everything that needed to be said was said, and everything that needed to be done was done. And what remained was this, the porch and the evening and the 2 of them and the crops coming in. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, by any honest measure, extraordinary.